There is a moment that happens near the end of nearly every relationship involving significant avoidant patterns, a moment where the other partner waits, genuinely waits, for some visible sign of struggle, some evidence that losing this connection actually costs something. And so often, that struggle simply never arrives. No dramatic plea, no visible desperation, just quiet acceptance, sometimes even relief, arriving where fighting for the relationship should logically be. Today we are going to name exactly why this happens, because the explanation has almost nothing to do with how much they actually cared, and understanding it fully changes how you interpret every ending you have ever experienced with someone carrying this particular pattern. Let's begin with the assumption most people carry into this confusion. The assumption that fighting for a relationship represents the natural, automatic response of anyone who genuinely values what they are about to lose. This assumption makes intuitive sense within most attachment styles, where the threat of loss typically activates increased effort, increased communication, increased visible attempts at repair. Avoidance psychology operates according to a fundamentally different internal logic, one where the threat of loss does not reliably activate fighting behavior at all, and understanding why requires looking considerably deeper than simple measurement of how much someone cared. Let's talk about what fighting for a relationship actually requires psychologically, because this requirement illuminates exactly where avoidant patterns create genuine obstruction. Fighting for connection requires openly declaring need, stating clearly and vulnerably that losing this person matters, that effort will be invested specifically because the outcome genuinely matters to you. This declaration represents one of the most exposed, most vulnerable positions a person can occupy within a relationship because it removes all protective ambiguity, placing genuine desire directly on display where it can be witnessed, judged, and potentially rejected. For someone whose entire psychological architecture organizes itself around avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, fighting for a relationship requires overriding the single, most deeply ingrained defensive instinct they possess. Let's talk about where this instinct originates, because tracing its roots explains why it operates with such disproportionate power during exactly the moments when fighting would matter most. Avoidant patterns typically develop through early experiences where expressed need went unmet, dismissed, or actively punished, teaching a developing child that declaring vulnerability openly leads to disappointment or humiliation rather than to comfort or repair. This early lesson does not simply fade with adulthood. It continues operating as an automatic, largely unconscious rule, one that activates most powerfully during exactly the moments that would require the greatest vulnerability, moments like watching a relationship end, when declaring need loudly and openly would represent precisely the kind of exposure this early conditioning taught them to avoid at nearly any cost. Let's talk about what happens instead when fighting does not occur, because the absence of visible struggle rarely means the absence of genuine internal experience. Many avoidant individuals report, once sufficient time and sufficient reflection eventually allow honest articulation, that they genuinely did not want the relationship to end, that considerable internal distress accompanied its ending, distress that simply never translated into the visible, act of fighting their partner may have been waiting to witness. This gap between genuine internal experience and genuine external behavior represents one of the most confusing, most painful aspects of avoidance psychology, because it leaves partners with no reliable external evidence matching whatever internal reality may have actually existed. Let's talk about why this gap exists so consistently, because understanding the specific mechanism clarifies why visible fighting proves so difficult to access even when genuine desire to preserve the relationship remains fully present. Fighting for a relationship requires sustained emotional exposure, not a single brief moment of vulnerability, but continued, repeated declaration extended across whatever timeline repair might require. This sustained exposure activates the same threat response responsible for avoidant withdrawal throughout the entire relationship's history, meaning the ending itself, rather than somehow overriding this defensive pattern through the urgency of impending loss, often simply triggers it more intensely than ever, precisely because the stakes have never felt higher. Let's talk about the specific paradox this creates. a paradox worth naming directly because it explains so much confusing behavior. The moment when fighting matters most, when genuine stakes are highest and genuine loss feels most imminent, is precisely the moment when avoidant defensive patterns activate most powerfully, creating maximum distance exactly when maximum closeness and maximum vulnerable effort would theoretically be required. This means the ending of a relationship involving significant avoidant patterns often looks like the opposite of what genuine internal caring would predict, not because caring is absent, but because the mechanism meant to protect against vulnerability operates most forcefully during precisely the circumstances that would require overriding it most significantly. Let's talk about what specific internal experience typically accompanies this silent, non-fighting, experience worth understanding, even though it remains largely invisible from the outside. Many avoidant individuals describe a kind of frozen quality during relationship endings, an awareness that fighting might help, sometimes even active internal urging toward reaching out or expressing genuine feeling, paired with an equally powerful, equally automatic resistance that prevents this urging from translating into actual visible action. This frozen quality does not represent simple indecision. It reflects genuine internal conflict between authentic desire and deeply conditioned defensive override. A conflict that, during moments of maximum stress, like relationship endings, tends to resolve in favor of the older, more automatic defensive pattern, rather than the newer, more vulnerable authentic desire. Let's talk about what role shame plays throughout this entire process. Shame, considerably more significant than most people initially recognize when trying to understand avoidant non-fighting. Fighting for a relationship, particularly after a partner has already begun withdrawing or already begun signaling exhaustion, requires tolerating the genuine possibility of rejection, the possibility that fighting might be witnessed and then dismissed anyway. For someone whose deepest fear involves confirmation of their own fundamental unlovability, this possibility of witnessed, rejected vulnerability often feels considerably more threatening than simply allowing the relationship to end without ever risking that particular exposure. In this sense, non-fighting sometimes functions as its own form of protection, protecting against the specific, acute pain of vulnerable effort being witnessed and then rejected regardless. Let's talk about the specific way pride sometimes intertwines with this shame, complicating the picture even further. Many avoidant individuals have built, over considerable time, a self-image organized around independence, around not needing anyone too intensely, around maintaining composure regardless of circumstance. Fighting visibly for a relationship threatens this self-image directly, requiring public departure from the identity they have spent years constructing and protecting. This threat to self-image operates alongside the deeper fear of rejection already discussed, creating a doubled resistance against visible fighting. Resistance rooted both in fear of vulnerability itself and in fear of abandoning a carefully maintained identity built specifically around avoiding that same vulnerability. Let's talk about what this understanding should specifically change about how you interpret the absence of fighting within your own experience, whether you are currently navigating a relationship's ending or processing one that has already concluded. The absence of visible fighting does not reliably indicate the absence of genuine internal caring. It indicates, considerably more often, the presence of a deeply conditioned defensive pattern that activates most powerfully during exactly the moments when overriding it would matter most, a pattern operating largely outside conscious control, rather than reflecting a deliberate, considered decision that the relationship simply was not worth fighting for. Let's talk about the specific danger of using this understanding to indefinitely excuse the pattern, or to continue hoping that sufficient patience will eventually produce visible fighting that the underlying psychology genuinely struggles to provide. Understanding why fighting does not occur offers genuine, valuable clarity, protecting you from the painful, inaccurate conclusion that your own worth or your own value explains its absence. This understanding does not obligate you to remain indefinitely within relationships that never receive visible defense, waiting for a form of effort that this particular psychological architecture may never reliably produce, regardless of how much genuine internal caring actually exists underneath the silence. Let's talk about what alternative forms of caring sometimes emerge in place of visible fighting. Forms worth recognizing, even though they rarely satisfy the specific need for dramatic, visible pursuit that many partners genuinely hope to witness during a relationship's difficult ending. This might include quieter forms of continued care, checking in occasionally without the intensity of visible pleading, small gestures offered without explanation, continued presence at reduced intensity rather than complete, immediate disappearance. These quieter expressions, while considerably less satisfying than dramatic fighting would be, sometimes represent the actual ceiling of what this particular defensive architecture allows, even when genuine internal caring extends considerably beyond what gets externally expressed. Let's talk about what genuine repair would actually require from someone whose patterns include this specific inability to fight visibly. Repair considerably more demanding than simply waiting for fighting to eventually appear on its own. Genuine repair requires developing conscious awareness of this specific pattern, recognizing explicitly that the instinct towards silence during moments of high-stakes vulnerability reflects old conditioning rather than accurate reflection of genuine desire. It requires deliberate practice, often uncomfortable practice, of overriding this instinct in smaller, lower-stakes moments first, building gradual capacity for vulnerable expression before the higher-stakes moment of an actual relationship ending ever arrives. It often requires professional support, given how deeply rooted this particular pattern typically proves to be, support capable of helping someone develop genuine tolerance for the exposure that fighting for anything meaningful inevitably requires. Let's talk about what your own healing specifically requires, given accurate understanding of why fighting never occurred within your own particular situation. Your healing requires releasing the specific, painful narrative that the absence of fighting definitively confirms you were not valued or not loved genuinely, replacing that narrative with accurate understanding that absence of visible fighting reflects a specific, deeply conditioned defensive pattern, rather than an accurate measurement of genuine internal experience. It requires distinguishing clearly between compassion for the origin of this pattern and continued willingness to remain within relationships that never provide the visible reciprocity and visible investment genuine partnership actually requires over time. Let's talk about what it means to grieve specifically the absence of fighting. Grief that deserves its own careful acknowledgement, separate from grieving the relationship's ending more broadly. There is a particular kind of loss involved in never having witnessed someone fight visibly for your relationship, a loss that exists even alongside accurate understanding of why that fighting never occurred. This grief is legitimate and deserves full acknowledgement, rather than being minimized simply because you now understand its psychological explanation. Understanding why something painful occurred does not eliminate the genuine pain that its occurrence actually produced. Let's talk about what specific self-worth work this particular grief requires. Work worth naming directly, given how easily the absence of visible fighting can erode confidence in one's own value over time. Rebuilding this confidence requires actively challenging the automatic conclusion that non-fighting proves inadequate worth, replacing that automatic conclusion with the more accurate understanding developed throughout this entire discussion. It requires surrounding yourself with relationships, platonic and otherwise, where genuine effort and genuine visible investment do occur reliably, providing living counter-evidence against whatever damage the earlier experience may have caused to your own sense of being worth fighting for. Let's talk about what remains true, regardless of whether this specific person ever develops genuine capacity for visible fighting, whether within this relationship's continued possibility or within some future relationship they eventually navigate. You deserve to be fought for. This deserves to be stated plainly rather than qualified extensively, because it represents a genuinely reasonable, genuinely healthy expectation within committed partnership, not an excessive demand requiring apology or justification. Someone's inability to meet this expectation, however understandable its psychological origins, does not lower the legitimacy of continuing to hold it as a genuine requirement for whatever partnership you ultimately choose to build your future around. Let's talk about what it means to hold both compassion and clarity simultaneously throughout this entire process. Compassion for the genuine psychological struggle that likely prevented visible fighting, paired with complete clarity that this struggle does not obligate you to accept its absence indefinitely without corresponding growth or corresponding change. These two positions coexist without contradiction, allowing genuine understanding of their internal experience while still protecting your own reasonable needs within any partnership moving forward. Let's talk about what specific evidence. Should this relationship continue, or should you eventually navigate a similar pattern with someone new, would indicate genuine growth toward greater capacity for visible fighting over time. This evidence includes increasing willingness to name their own fear directly rather than simply enacting its behavioral symptoms without explanation. It includes small, incremental instances of vulnerable expression during lower stakes moments, evidence that the capacity for exposure is gradually developing rather than remaining permanently frozen at its current level. It includes genuine curiosity about their own patterns when gently named, rather than immediate defensiveness or immediate dismissal whenever the absence of fighting gets directly addressed. Let's talk about what patience throughout this developmental process genuinely requires. Patience considerably different from indefinite waiting extended without any corresponding evidence of movement. This patience involves holding realistic timeline expectations, recognizing that overriding deeply conditioned defensive patterns typically requires considerable sustained effort rather than sudden, dramatic transformation. It also involves maintaining firm boundaries regarding how much continued absence of effort you remain willing to accept, boundaries that protect your own well-being regardless of how sympathetically you understand the psychological origins of the pattern you continue witnessing. Let's talk about a specific complication worth examining directly. Situations where some minimal effort does appear, a single message, a brief attempt at conversation, effort that technically qualifies as fighting but falls dramatically short of what genuine, sustained pursuit would actually look like. This minimal effort deserves honest naming for what it typically represents, the absolute limit of what the underlying defensive architecture currently allows, rather than genuine, wholehearted attempt at repair. Recognizing this distinction protects against mistaking minimal, token gesture for the genuine, sustained fighting that healthy partnership actually requires during moments of significant threat to the relationship's continuation. Let's talk about what happens specifically when a partner, understandably frustrated by this pattern, attempts to provoke fighting deliberately, creating additional distance or additional ultimatum specifically designed to force a visible reaction. This strategy deserves careful examination because it frequently produces the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than triggering the desired fighting response, deliberate provocation often simply intensifies the underlying defensive activation already discussed throughout this conversation, pushing someone further into frozen withdrawal rather than somehow forcing them past it into visible, vulnerable pursuit. This explains why ultimatums and deliberate distance so frequently fail to produce genuine fighting, even when they succeed in producing considerable additional pain for everyone involved. Let's talk about what a more effective approach might involve. Should you genuinely wish to create conditions where fighting becomes more possible rather than less possible, this might involve explicitly communicating that visible effort, however imperfect or however uncomfortable it feels to offer, would be received with genuine openness rather than judgment, reducing at least one layer of the fear driving the freeze response in the first place. This might involve modeling vulnerable communication yourself, demonstrating that expressed need does not automatically produce the rejection or humiliation their earlier conditioning taught them to expect. Neither approach guarantees success, but both create considerably more favorable conditions than provocation or ultimatum typically manage to produce. Let's talk about the specific grief involved in recognizing that no amount of your own effort can fully guarantee this particular transformation. Grief worth naming directly, rather than glossing over with false reassurance. You can create favorable conditions. You can model healthy vulnerability. You can communicate clearly that effort would be welcomed rather than punished. And still, ultimately, whether someone develops genuine capacity to override deeply conditioned defensive patterns remains their own internal work to complete, work that your effort alone cannot force into existence, regardless of how skillfully or how patiently you approach it. Let's talk about what it means to distinguish between a single relationship's specific outcome and the broader pattern this discussion has been describing throughout. Because generalizing too broadly from one particular experience risks creating unfair, inaccurate expectations projected onto every future person you might encounter. Not every avoidant individual experiences this pattern with identical intensity, and some, through considerable prior internal work or through particularly favorable relational circumstances, have already developed greater capacity for visible fighting than others still early in their own process of understanding and addressing these patterns. Holding this variation in mind protects against either universal cynicism or universal unwarranted optimism when navigating future relationships involving similar underlying psychology. Let's talk about what specific questions might help you evaluate a future partner's genuine capacity for eventual fighting. Questions worth considering during earlier, lower stakes stages of a relationship, rather than only discovering the answer during an actual, painful ending. Notice how someone handles smaller moments of conflict, or smaller moments requiring vulnerable expression throughout the relationship's ordinary, daily texture. Someone who gradually demonstrates increasing capacity for these smaller, vulnerable moments over time likely carries greater capacity for eventual fighting during a genuine crisis than someone whose pattern remains rigidly, consistently avoidant across every single instance, regardless of stakes involved. Let's talk about what self-protection specifically requires moving forward, given everything this discussion has explored regarding why avoidant fighting so rarely occurs, even when genuine internal caring remains present. Self-protection does not require becoming cynical toward every future partner exhibiting any avoidant tendency whatsoever. It requires maintaining realistic expectations calibrated to actual observed evidence rather than to hopeful projection, continuing to require genuine, sustained effort over time as the actual standard for healthy partnership, regardless of how sympathetically you might understand any individual partner's specific struggle to meet that standard consistently. Let's talk, finally, about what this entire understanding offers you beyond simply explaining one particular painful experience from your own past. It offers a genuinely more accurate lens through which to interpret confusing relational behavior generally, protecting you from the corrosive, inaccurate conclusion that absence of visible effort always and automatically indicates absence of genuine care. It offers considerably more nuanced compassion, extended without requiring you to abandon your own reasonable standards regarding what genuine partnership actually requires. And it offers, perhaps most importantly, permission to continue believing fully in your own worth that never depended on someone else's capacity to override patterns built considerably before you ever became part of their story. Let's talk about a specific pattern worth naming: the way some avoidant individuals process the aftermath of not fighting, sometimes arriving, weeks or months later, at genuine regret regarding their own silence during the relationship's ending. This delayed regret often surfaces once sufficient distance has allowed the acute defensive activation to settle, permitting clearer, more honest reflection than was accessible during the emotionally overwhelming moment of the actual ending itself. This delayed regret, when it occurs, does not retroactively provide the fighting that never happened when it mattered, but it does offer additional confirmation that genuine caring likely existed throughout, caring that simply could not translate into visible action during the specific window when action would have carried the most weight. Let's talk about what this delayed regret means for you specifically, should you ever encounter evidence of it, whether through their own eventual communication or through information reaching you indirectly. This regret does not obligate you to reopen a relationship that has already, appropriately, concluded, nor does it retroactively erase the genuine pain of having navigated an ending without the visible reciprocity you deserved to receive. It simply offers additional confirming evidence supporting everything discussed throughout this conversation that the absence of fighting reflected genuine psychological limitation rather than genuine absence of care. Let's talk about the specific difference between accepting this understanding intellectually and genuinely feeling its truth throughout your own body and your own emotional experience. Because these two forms of understanding often develop at different paces. You might recognize intellectually everything discussed throughout this entire conversation, while still carrying residual emotional conviction that the absence of fighting somehow proved your own inadequacy. Closing this gap between intellectual understanding and genuine emotional integration often requires considerable time, sometimes requiring deliberate practice, journaling, or therapeutic support, specifically focused on helping this accurate understanding settle fully into your embodied experience, rather than remaining purely conceptual. Let's talk about what specific practice might help support this deeper integration. Practice worth considering directly. This might involve deliberately revisiting memories of the relationship's ending while consciously applying this new understanding. Noticing where old, inaccurate conclusions still feel emotionally convincing, and gently, repeatedly replacing them with the more accurate framework this discussion has provided. It might involve speaking this understanding aloud, whether to a trusted friend, a therapist, or even to yourself privately, allowing the accurate narrative to become as familiar and as readily accessible as the earlier, more painful narrative once was. Let's talk about what remains available to you once this integration has genuinely occurred. Integration that protects not just your understanding of this one specific relationship, but your broader capacity to interpret future relational confusion accurately. You now carry genuine embodied knowledge that visible effort and genuine internal caring do not always move in perfect synchrony, particularly within psychology shaped by significant early conditioning around the dangers of expressed vulnerability. This knowledge protects you from repeating the same painful, inaccurate self-blame should you ever encounter a similar pattern again, while also allowing genuine compassion for whoever you might encounter navigating this particular struggle in the future. Let's talk about what genuine peace ultimately looks like once this entire understanding has settled fully. Peace that does not require the other person's acknowledgement, does not require their eventual regret, does not require any external confirmation whatsoever in order to remain complete and genuinely stable. This peace exists simply through your own accurate understanding, held firmly, regardless of whether anyone else ever validates it. Trusting fully that your own worth was never determined by someone else's capacity to visibly demonstrate what may have genuinely, quietly existed within them all along.